Shalom Aleichem. It is now being Thursday evening, Or Yom Shishi. It is now Or Aleph B'Chislev, Rosh Chodesh Kislev Tavshin Pei Wav, corresponding to the 20th of November 2025. Leminyanam. We are in Hilchot Kriyat Shema Rambam, Perek Sheni, Halacha Wav. Haya Osek Ba'achila, or Shehaya B'Mirhas. If a person was eating a meal or was literally in the bathhouse, one doesn't have to be in the bathhouse, one can be in the bath, one can be in the shower. Or sheya'osek b'tisporeth, or he was getting his hair cut, etc. These are activities which used to take a fair amount of time. Or sheya mehapech be'oroth, in other words, what's called a bursiki in Lashon Hazal, a person who tans hides for a living, and that's also an involved process, and these things take time. Or shayu osakim badin, or dayanim hachamim who were involved in some kind of a legal case. Gomer, he should finish what he's doing. Wahalkach kore kriyat Shema. In other words, as opposed to the previous halacha, where we saw that a person or persons studying Torah, ya'osek b'talmud Torah in halacha hey, v'gi'azman kriyat Shema, posek v'koreh u'mevarech, and then he continues with his learning. Here, if a person is involved in one of these activities, gomer, he is allowed to finish what he's doing at that moment. V'halkach koreh kriyat Shema. But if a person is concerned, is worried that the Zman for Kriyat Shema will pass, that is praiseworthy, that is the correct thing to do. Now we continue. A person needed to go to the mikveh according to, based on the Takanah Ezra Sofer, Uveth Dino, according to which a person does not study Torah or Tefillah, and this also therefore applies to Kriyat Shema, because Kriyat Shema is a form of Talmud Torah, and the Mishneh explicitly addresses such a question. What does a person do with regards to Kriyat Shema, as we shall see? So a person wanted to be mitahir, to make himself tahor. And now it is time to read the Shema in the morning, in the early morning, just before sunrise. If a person is able to finish the tevilah, can't get out of the mikveh, the water, to cover himself with any garment or anything that he has, so that he's able, so he won't be naked, so that he's able to read Kriyat Shema, then he should do so. That is the correct thing to do. Because Zman Kriyat Shema lechatchila in the morning, as we saw previously, is ad hanes ahama, certainly according to the Rambam. If the person is concerned that he will not be able to get out of the water and cover himself before he can, in order to read Kriyat Shema before sunrise, kodem sheikra yitkaseh b'mayim shehu omed bahen v'yikra. He should cover himself in the water in which he is in tovel just this moment, and use that as a garment, as it were. The assumption is that the water is not clear, therefore his body cannot be seen through the water, and therefore the water acts like a garment. It goes without saying that a person in this situation does not recite Pesukei Hazemer, Pesukei de Zimra, and it's also obvious that a person in this situation does not recite Tefillah, Shema Esrei. We're talking only about Kriyat Shema. However, if the water has this place where this person is being tovel, is an unpleasant smell there. This is water in which flax was soaked. It also tends not to have a pleasant smell. But not in clear water. Because in that case, his nakedness will not be covered. So that's not acceptable, if that's the situation. It is possible, as what the Mishnah that discusses this is referring to, is a mikveh where the mayim are achurim, that is to say, very murky. She'en rehan ra, and it does not have an unpleasant odor, and read Kriyat Shema in that situation. That is preferable to waiting to come out and dress, etc. That is what the Mishnah states. And this is what Rambam is quoting here. And there is what to discuss regarding this sugya. We won't go into all the details now, but according to the Talmud Bavli, that's the pshat. The Mishnah is referring to the shita of Rabbi Eliezer, or others who agree with Rabbi Eliezer. And the question is, should that therefore be halacha lema'aseh for everybody today? But Rambam clearly thinks that it is. So, if a person is in that situation, this is what he is to do.
It's interesting, Rabbi, that this seems to indicate that at least according to the Rambam and those who follow his shita, that saying Kriyat Shema before Hanetzach Hama is not related to being Somech Gula Tefillah. It's a mitzvah in its own right.
That's entirely true. That is correct. If, in other words, you could put it in another way. What you're saying is true. You could express it as follows. According to the Rif also follows this shita, and this aligns with the shita, as you mentioned, Rabbi Eliezer. According to that, tefillah k'wathikin, in other words, reciting Kriyat Shema shortly before sunrise, and then immediately proceeding to the tefillah, to the Shmoneh Esrei, with the sunrise, as the sun rises. There are two elements involved. There are two reasons to do that. One is because that is the end of Zman Kriyat Shema, the sunrise, and therefore you should read before the sun rises. And B, the inyan of tefillah with the Hanetzach Hama, with the sunrise. So there are two reasons to do this. Whereas, according to those who disagree, shall we say Rabbi Yoshua, then the inyan of kewathikin, tefillah kewathikin, is entirely about either the semichut of Gula Tefillah, juxtaposing Kriyat Shema with the brachot to the Tefillah, and also the inyan of Tefillah at that time, at that moment when the sun rises, but not because of Zman Kriyat Shema. Rambam brings this, quotes this Mishnah, as we see, and as we saw earlier also, this is what Rambam told us about Zman Kriyat Shema previously. So you can see here in Halacha Yud Aleph Yod Bet, in the previous perek, Ve'ezahu Zmana Bayom, Rambam says, Miswatha Sheyadhil Likroth Kodem Hanetzach Hama, Kadeh Sheyigmor Likroth ולברך ברכה אחרונה עם הנס החמה. Shiur, etc. We saw this. And Rambam says it takes about 6 minutes, 1/10 of an hour. It is possible to make the mitzvah after sunrise. So Rambam's shita is clearly that lechatchila, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer essentially.
If I may comment, it doesn't seem like Rabbi Eliezer's shita either. Rabbi Eliezer would say that the 40 minutes or the hour before is also okay.
No, Vadai, the Stam Mishnah states that the Zman Kriyat Shema begins Mishi Akir ben Techelef Lavan, which is about 50 minutes before the sun rises, at least in Eretz Yisrael on an average day. But Rabbi Eliezer does hold that the Zman for Kriyat Shema in the morning is over when the sun is up. So that Mishnah, which speaks about reciting Kriyat Shema when standing in the Mikveh Lamash, and this would be referring to a mikveh somewhere outside in a field or something like that, not in a bathhouse. In other words, a place where people are habitually naked. There it's a sort to recite Kriyat Shema. So practically speaking, in most mikvaot you would come across today, this would not be possible. It might be possible if you were to be tovel in some kind of a ma'ayan, a spring or something in a natural setting. It is possible. Rambam continues now. Halacha Het Hakore Kriyat Shema Lo yirmoz ba'ino V'lo yikros b'sfato V'lo yar'a ba'asba'otho. In other words, a person should not involve in any kind of communication with anybody else, even if it's non-verbal, during Kriyat Shema. Why should one not do this if one's not speaking? What's the problem? Kadeh shelo teheh kriyat aray. So that the reading will not be, as it were, an afterthought, something by the way. You're really involved in something else. You're trying to convey something to somebody. You're engaged in some kind of a conversation, even though it's non-verbal. That is called Kriyat Aray. In other words, making the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema an afterthought, something secondary, something Aray, something which is not your main focus. Now, if a person did so whilst reading Kriyat Shema, it's meghuneh. In other words, it's definitely improper. Literally, meghuneh means unseemly. But the person is yetzer dehava nevertheless. And a person is required to recite Kriyat Shema lechatchila. That's why it says with sarich. The word sarich means almost always lechatchila, but by the avad, the halacha is not so. Sarich lashmi'a le'ozno keshehu koreh, ve'im lo yishmi'a le'ozno yasa. The person who did not do so is yotzer dehava, but that's not the halacha. Is that you should read it aloud and with care. That's what the next statement says. With sarich ledakdek be'othotheha. There's also a girsa be'othiotheha. In the Mishnah, the original girsa is be'othotheha. Ve'im lo dikdek yasa. Here too, the hatchila person has to be medakdek. Rambam will explain in a moment what that means. One has to read with precision, according to the nature and the rules of Lashon HaKodesh, of Hebrew grammar. And one has to not to garble words, not run words together, and etc., etc. So the reading has to be done in a very pedantic fashion, shall we say. The obvious reason for these halachot, is so that a person will be focused focus entirely on what they're doing, and not on anything else. That is the purpose of these halachot. That the Kriyat Shema should be read with care and with concentration. And one of the ways to ensure that is to instruct a person that you have to read very carefully and entirely precisely, and therefore you must focus on what you're saying, and thus you will also be able to focus your mind on the message, the ideas, the words, not just the reading in a technical sense.
Rabbi, this also, I think, proves what you were saying last time, that Kriyat Torah is not only about kavanah.
That is true. That is quite right. Well pointed out. Very well. All right, we continue. Kesad medakdek, says Rambam. So when we just said tzarich ledakdek ba'otioteha, what does that mean? Yizaher shelo yarpe hahazak ulo yahazek harafeh ulo yanid hanah ulo yaniah hanad. So we're talking here about Othioth Refuyoth, so it seems, and Hazakoth and Derushoth, so the difference between a Beth and a Veth, or a Gimel and a Gimel, a Daled, Kaf, Chaf, Pe, Fe, Tau, Thau. In other words, even if you read, instead of Thiseth, you read Thiseit. Yatzathe de Hova, but it's not, your Kriya is not Medugdeket, it's not precise. And that's not how you should read it. Then that's with regards to Rafeh and Hazak or Darush. And the same is true even for a letter which has a Dagesh, not the kind of Dagesh we just spoke of now, but like a Shema as opposed to a Shema Nah, or anything of that sort. You have other letters also where you have Dagesh Hazak. So you should read Lechatchila with great precision, which also means that you need to know which Dagesh is which, and how to pronounce the various letters. It goes without saying, and the Rambam is not even mentioning here the obvious, that you should read Kriyat Shema, pronouncing each word, each letter correctly. So if you are unable to pronounce the letter Ain as opposed to an Aleph, or you're unable to pronounce the letter Het as opposed to a Chaf, or a Kaf as opposed to a Qof, etc., you have no way that you can recite Kriyat Shema correctly, the Chatchila. It's all b'di'avad. As I have a sefer here called, it's the Kisur, the abbreviated, abridged version of the sefer written by Mori Rabbi Ben Sion Kohen, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, which he named Sefat Emeth, and then a short version of that same sefer is called Kosht Divrei Emeth. And in that book he quotes a haskama given to another person. I can't remember the name of the book, but another person who I have not met, but I believe he is originally from the United States, some kind of Tamid Chachamim Haredi Americani, as they say. I don't know exactly. I can't remember. I have it written here somewhere. I could quote it to you if necessary. And there is a haskama from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zetzal. Hagon Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was unusual compared to many of the Hachamim of that time and place, of that background, that ilk, because he was willing to recognize the truth and speak the truth, even if it was not always what people were hoping or expecting to hear. So a person, so is related there that someone said to Rav Kamenetsky about the correct pronunciation, which apparently I don't know exactly. I can't tell you how Rav Kamenetsky pronounced Shema Kodesh. I don't know. People who knew him directly might be able to tell us. I did not know. But apparently he recognized that there were the standard pronunciation, which I guess was some kind of Ashkenazi's pronunciation, was not correct. So someone asked him, are you suggesting that the Baal Hidushei Harim is what he quotes there, did not recite Kriyat Shema properly? He said, there's no question, but lechatchila, very possibly, almost certainly not. If a person wishes to content themselves with doing everything with the avad, okay, what can I say? What can one do? That's what a person aspires to. But if a person can aspire and can find out and can learn that which is correct, then hopefully a Jew wishes to do that which is lechatchila and not that which is b'di'avad. And not only in terms of practical, technical, halachic definitions and considerations, but also recognizing the fact that most Jews at this point in history do not know how to pronounce Lashon HaKodesh properly, obviously is the result, and all the various pronunciations that exist in the Jewish world today, Ashkenazi and Sfaradi and Temani and many, many others and subgroups. That fact is, of course, attributable to one thing and one thing only, and that is the Galuth, the Galuth, the exile of the Jewish people to all corners of the earth for such a long period of time, resulted in terrible shibushim, horrendous distortions of the Hebrew language. This is something which is self-evident, should be self-evident, and we should obviously wish to remove the signs of that galut from ourselves, from our beings, from our daily practice and behavior as Jews. So at least one would think. So Rambam says, "Kesad medakdek yizaher shelo yarpe hazak v'lo yahazek harafa v'lo yanid hanah v'lo yaniah hanad. Lefichach tzarich liten rewach ben kol shetei othoth." Interestingly here, there are more Kidvei that have the word othoth here as opposed to otioth, which is actually, I think, the more original girasa. But 2 lines ago we saw the othiotheha as in most of the sources rather than othotheha. But actually, I think othotheha is the correct version, and here it says explicitly kol shte othoth. In other words, any 2 letters hadomoth which are identical. Shahat mehem sof teva wahat tehilat teva semucha la. So when you have 2 words, the last letter of the first word is the same letter as the first letter of the next word, such as he says kehon bechol levavecha. So you have a lamed and a lamed, and you can easily run them together, and it would come out bechol levavecha, and then we would not be pronouncing 2 lameds but 1 lamed. You would run them into one word, and that would not be medukdak. That would not be kriyat medukdaket. Chore bechol. You read the word bechol first, v'shoher, and wait a split second. Stop. Pause for a split second. V'chozer v'koreh levavecha. And the same, W'chen Lavatem Mehera, for the same reason, and the same Hakanaf Pathil. Now, the Hakanaf Pathil is a slightly different example because it's a Per Refuya followed by a Per de Rouja. So they're not exactly identical, but they're close. And it's possible to read Hakanaf Pathil because without really distinguishing completely or pausing between them. So this is also considered an example, although a slightly less obvious example. These are, of course, mentioned in the Talmud, these examples. V'sarich leva'er zayin, leva'er, that is to say, to stress the zayin in the word l'ma'an tizkeru. V'sarich leharich bedal, the word dal is the letter dalet, the same, another way of expressing the name of that letter. וצריך להאריך בדל של אחד, כדי שימליכהו על השמיים ועל הארץ ועל ארבע רוחות. So when reciting Shema, the word ahad, if it's pronounced correctly, that is to say, dalad refuya, one is able to lengthen and extend the pronunciation of that dalad, because it's a the which one can extend, which as opposed to a dalad, which is a plosive, which you cannot possibly extend for any length of time beyond the split second it takes to pronounce the dalad. And during that time, one should concentrate on the fact that, as he says, as Rambam says, Kadesh Licheu ala Shamayim, wa'al ha'aretz, wa'al baruchot, wa'al baruchot. There is a Girsa, wa'al baruchot ha'olam, also. וצריך שלא יחטוף בחטא, כדי שלא יהא כאומר ahad. In other words, one has to pronounce the word ahad properly and not be so concentrated and focused on the dalad at the end that one forgets to pronounce the het, give it its due, so to speak. Very well. So this all pertains to reciting Kriyat Shema, as one should, lechatchila b'lashon hakodesh, in Hebrew. But what if a person doesn't understand Hebrew? There may be a very good Jew who, for various reasons, doesn't really understand the Hebrew of the Torah very well. It also could be, we could refer to a ger tzedek, a convert, very proper, righteous, sincere ger tzedek, convert, but his Hebrew is not yet up to par. What should he do with regards to Kriyat Shema? Because he doesn't understand what he might say in Hebrew. So Rambam says in Halacha Yod, Kore Adam et Shema b'chol loshon sheyeh makira, or shehu makira. There are both these readings. In some of the Tfusim it says instead of makira, mevina, but that's totally spurious. So a person should recite Kriyat Shema in the language which he understands well. Shumakira. V'kore b'chol loshon, and whatever language in which you recite Kriyat Shema, tzarich lizaher midivrei shibush shebotha haloshon. If you translate it, therefore, you're reading a translation or reciting a translation, or you're reciting it based on what you see in the Hebrew and reciting it off the top of your head, you have to do it. You have to translate very precisely. ומדקדק באותה הלשון כמו שמדקדק בלשון הקודש, אם קראה בלשון הקודש. So it is possible to recite Kriyat Shema in another language. It's not lechatchila, it's not the best thing in the world, but it's possible. And that's preferable to reciting Kriyat Shema and understanding what you're saying. That's the point. Again, we see that the ikar is that a person be focused and understand what they're saying and be able to concentrate and internalize the message, the words, the ideas encapsulated within Kriyat Shema. He who reads Kriyat Shema backwards, what does that mean? not to read the actual word backwards, in which case it's gibberish and means nothing at all, but rather to read the Pesukim in reverse order, to read the last Pasuk of Kriyat Shema, shall we say, and then the Pasuk, penultimate Pasuk, etc. As we just explained. If a person, for whatever reason, either because he was confused or because for some strange reason he thought it was a good idea, he read the Parashiyot in the reverse order. He read Parashat Sithit first, Vayomer first, and then Vayom Shema, and then Shema, or in some other strange order. Afalpi Sheno Rashai, a person is not allowed to choose to do such a thing. That's not correct. Ani Omer Sheyasa, Rambam says, I claim, I understand, I believe such a person was Yosef Hova. In other words, for whatever reason, a person read Kriyat Shema in the Parashiyot, not in the correct order, not 1, 2, 3, but 1, 3, 2, or 3, 2, 1, or whatever. And then he came to ask the question, was I Yosef Hova? Do I have to recite it again? That's the question. Rambam says, if you ask me, I would say Yatsa Dehova. Not correct, not proper, shouldn't have done it, true. But the person was Yatsa Dehova because this is not Bichlal, this is not included within the concept HaKoreh Mafreah, where the halacha is Lo Yatsa. But that means that he didn't read the parasha Kesidra either. He read the psukim in reverse order. And that changes the meaning or the connection between the psukim and the ideas, and that is why it's not Yosef Yehovah. In other words, the order of the Parashiyot is Wadai lo min Torah. No one would deny that. The order of the Parashiyot. But Rabbi Yoshua ben Korha says in the Mishneh, why we read Shema first, and then Vayom Shema, and then on Siseit Parashat Vayomer, is the reason is given, but in a very obvious and clear reason, but it's not ma'akev, says Rambam. Ani omer sheyasa lefi she'ena semucha la b'Torah. In other words, it's not as if these parashiyot come one on the heel of the other. So you could claim, well, you have to read it exactly as it appears in the Torah, 1, 2, 3. They don't appear in that fashion in the Torah. They're taken from various places in the Torah. All right, what else does Rambam say here? Kara pasuk. Let's say a person was reciting Shema Yisrael, and he said the pasuk once, Shema Yisrael, and he had kavanah, and everything is fine. And he gets so enthused and excited about the content of this and the message behind this pasuk, and he wishes to repeat the pasuk, not for any. He's not trying to be a jackass. He's just trying to. He wishes to recite a second time this very central pasuk. Lichora, his intentions are good. Nevertheless, Rambam says, that is improper. That is not to be. We cannot acquiesce to such behavior. In general, repeating things unnecessarily is not the act of a chacham, but the act of a hediot. As it says in the Yerushalmi, Kol ha-patur min hadavar v'osehu nikra hediot. He who is patur, exempt from doing something and does it anyhow, he is announcing to all that he's a hediot, that he's not very wise, not very learned, and he's an amharetz, essentially. So that is not something you should do. You don't read a pasuk twice, unless you think that you didn't read it correctly the first time. Well, then you would read it the second time. That would not be mechuneh, that would be correct. Or if one read the pasuk Shema Yisrael, where kavanah is required, and one realizes that one read it without kavanah, one was daydreaming, as reciting the pasuk, then you would have to return and again repeat that pasuk. So Rambam says, Kara mila ahath uchfala. You read one word and repeated that word. For instance, Kara Shema Shema. Such a person is told to be quiet. In other words, we chastise him, we tell him off, and we tell him this is not something that you do. Even though, again, the kavanah might be a positive one, In other words, Shema, which means understand, internalize, and you wish to repeat it to yourself how much you need to internalize this. That's very good. Your intention is pure, perhaps, but it's not correct to repeat a word of Kriyat Shema twice gratuitously. If one thinks one mispronounced the word or didn't have kavanah when reciting that word or that pasuk, then it's legitimate to do so. Halacha Yod Bet. Qira'ah Seruchim Yasa, which means you recited Kriyat Shema, but not at one sitting. You read part of it now, and then you waited a while, and then you recited another part of Kriyat Shema, etc. That's called Seruchim, in installments, as it were. Afilu shaha ben seruch leseruch kadeh ligmor et kura yatha. Even if you, let's say you read the first parasha, and for whatever reason you stopped, you did something else, or you were thinking about something else, or you decided to learn something else in the middle, and then you went back to the second parasha and you recited the second parasha, and so on. Even if the time, the interval between reading the first parasha and the second parasha, for example, doesn't have to be a whole parasha, but let's say we're talking about one parasha and then another parasha, and the interval was such that you could have read all of Kriyat Shema during that time, so it's more than 6 minutes, shall we say. Let's say it was 10 minutes. Nevertheless, yasa. Wuhu shikra ala seder, as long as you read Kriyat Shema in the correct order. And not jumble the order of the Pesukim as we saw before. With regards to the Parashiot, we saw the Rambam says that if you change the order of the Parashiot, you read them in the non-standard order, then Yasa Dehova. But reading, even if you read in installments, L'Serubin, one shouldn't, that is no excuse for doing that. In fact, one should not do it at all, because Qara'a Serubin Yasa, which means B'di'avad. Yasa is always B'di'avad. So that's not what you do. It's something that you should not do. But if you did it, and you didn't say anything else, you didn't interrupt with anything else in between, you didn't speak in between, etc., then Yasa Yadeh Hava. Qira'a mitnamnem, if a person recited Kriyat Shema whilst being mitnamnem, which means dropping off to sleep. Wahu mi she'eno lo'ir v'lo nirdam b'shena. In other words, the Rambam is explaining the term mitnamnem, which means a person who is not completely asleep and also not completely awake. Mi she'eno lo'ir v'lo nirdam b'shena. Yasa, a person is Yotzei Dehova if one did so. Ubivad she'yeh e'er b'fasuk rishon. But a person has to be fully aware of what he is saying when reciting the first pasuk, as we learned previously, that is the ikar kavanah. It has to be present during the first pasuk. Halacha Yod Gimel. Safek kara kriyat shema, safek lo kara. If a person is unsure whether they recited kriyat shema, it could be morning, that could be evening, it doesn't make a difference. Hozer v'koreh. If a person does not know, then he has to recite Kriyat Shema. It might be the first time he's reciting because he doesn't know, and it may be the second time, but he's not sure, so he has to repeat Kriyat Shema. In the Talmud, we see that, based on what we see in both Talmudim, we can understand that this halacha is based on either on the idea that Kriyat Shema is minat Torah, at least the essential concept of the mitzvah is minat Torah, and therefore it's like any mitzvah minat Torah, like similar to Birkat HaMazon, which is minat Torah, and if you're not sure if you recited it, then you have to recite it again, or possibly a second time. In other words, sofek minat Torah lehumra, or even if you hold that Kriyat Shema is not minat Torah, which, as I've mentioned, is actually the original position of the Talmud Bavli, there is nevertheless another reason, a powerful reason, to grant a special status to Kriyat Shema, even though you claim it technically it's midivrei sofarim, and that is that it's Kamrat Malchut Shamayim. Kabbalat Malchut Shamayim is a very essential, fundamental, and central aspect of being a Jew, first of all, and certainly of this mitzvah. So, if one is not sure whether one recited Kriyat Shema, then one has to recite Kriyat Shema again, either because it's Minat Torah or because of the importance of Kabbalat Malchut Shamayim. And Malchut Shamayim basically means that a person accepts literally the yoke of heaven. That is to say, that a person accepts the fact that there is a power above him, that a person is required to subordinate himself to that power, that in other words, to Hashem Yitbarach, the Creator, and everything else flows from that. If a person doesn't accept that, then there is no Torah, and there is nothing at all, essentially. Then you end up with what we find around about us, which is essentially tohu wavohu. And this is in no way an exaggeration. One simply has to step outside for a moment and one sees the reality. Tohu wavohu, for those who do not know, means complete nothingness and confusion. All right. So Rambam says, Safek kara Kriyat Shema, Safek lo kara. If a person doesn't know if he read Kriyat Shema or not, he doesn't remember. Maybe he was very tired when he read it, and his memory is not sharp and doesn't recall exactly. You have to repeat it, and not only do you repeat Kriyat Shema, u'mevarech lefaneo lahareh. And the brachot are certainly not minat Torah. That we know. And there's also a fact that the brachot are not ma'akvot. In other words, if you just read the parashiot of Shema without the brachot, you performed the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. Not in the proper way, not l'chatchila, but you performed the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema b'diavad. When you're not sure, you have to repeat the whole mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, which comes with the brachot. In other words, you cannot differentiate between the brachot and Kriyat Shema itself. It's one indivisible whole and package. Aval im yada shekara. If a person knows for a fact they said Shema, when istapek lo im berech lefaneo lahareh or lo berech, but he's not certain if he recited the brachot or not, eno hozam v'varech. There, you're not required to repeat the brachot alone. If you know that the parashiot you did recite. Then, if you're not sure, if you're sure you did not, then you have to recite them. But if you're not sure, you may have recited them, you do not have to repeat the brachot. Qara wa ta'a yahzor lemakom sheta'a. If a person was reading Kriyat Shema and made a mistake. What does that mean, made a mistake? For instance, he doesn't remember where he was. He lost his train of thought. Or he confused two pasukim which are similar. For instance, the pasuk Uchtavtam appears both in the appears both in the first and the second parasha, and you may recite that pasuk and not remember if you were in the first parasha or already in the second parasha. In that case, you should return to the point where you're sure before which you think that you went wrong. So in the case of Uchtavtam, you go back to the first Uchtavtam. And anything similar, or if a person was reciting Kriyat Shema by heart, which is fine, but all of a sudden he got confused. He forgot what the rest of how the pasuk continues, or the next pasuk. So you go back to the point where you know that up to that point you had recited it correctly, and you continue once again from there. Ne'ala mimenu ben parasha lefarasha. When you're there, ezo hi parasha hishlim wa ezo tzarich latchil. In other words, a person was reading Kriyat Shema, got to the end of a parasha, but he's not sure which parasha he just finished. Again, this can only really happen if a person is not really focused, or extremely tired, or what have you. But it can happen. So a person completed, say, the first parasha, but he's not sure if I read the first and the second, or I just finished the first now. He knows that he completed one parasha, but he's not sure which. And if he maybe only has to now repeat, say, Parashat Vayomer, the third parasha, and maybe he's only recited the first parasha, so he has to begin from Vayom Shema. So he's not sure. Hozel Ferek Rishon Shehu Avtat Hashem Lokecha. So he should go back to where he knows that he's beginning, where he can be certain that he's starting from a point where he didn't recite properly before, and he starts from the Parasha Rishonah, from U'ahavta. He knows he recited Shema, and he thought he maybe finished or didn't finish. He's not quite clear, so he should continue from U'ahavta, which is the second pasuk of the first parasha. And you will note in this halacha that Rambam began by saying Ne'ala mimenu ben parasha to parasha. Hozel perek rishon. Rambam uses the terms parasha and perek interchangeably. They refer to the same thing. This sometimes is the case in the lashon of the Rambam. And therefore, based on what we said before, kara wa ta'a yahzol makom sheta'a. Therefore, the next statement in halacha yud dalet is ta'a be'emtha perek. If a person somehow got mixed up or lost in the middle of a perek, v'lo yada hechan pasach. He's not quite sure where he is. It could happen, for example, if a person was reciting Shema and dropped off to sleep for a moment, and then all of a sudden woke up and realizes he remembers he was in the first parasha, but he doesn't remember exactly where. Hozel Rosh HaPerek, then you should go back to the beginning of that perek, where you know that you were in the middle of that perek. You would go to the beginning. Haya kore uchtavtam, when you're there, imhu uchtavtam shebeshma or be'uchtavtam shebehayom shema, hozel uchtavtam shebeshma, as we explained before. ואם נסתפק לו אחר שקרא למען ירבו, אינו חוזר שעל הרגל שלו הוא הולך. In other words, even if a person wasn't sure at the moment when he was reciting the words Uchtavtam, he wasn't sure for a moment. It wasn't quite clear to him whether I'm in the first parasha or the second parasha. But then he finds himself by habit immediately going on to the Ma'an Yirbu Yemechem, which is the end of the second parasha. We rely on his habit. In other words, we assume that his tongue, his mind knows where he was better than he knows sometimes. So if he immediately went on Leman Yirbu, he must have been there. Halakha Tetwell. Hayakor ufagat ba'ahirim. Or paga'u bo. It doesn't mean that he struck someone. It means that he ran into someone. Met someone. And this person addressed him, or he thinks he should address this person. Im haya ben perek leferek, if he was at the point in Kriyat Shema where he was actually between parakim, he just finished the first perek, shall we say, and hasn't yet begun the second. Posek umahil, v'shoel v'shalom mishu hayav v'chvodo. If it's somebody to whom he owes kavod, to whom he owes respect, shall we say, a great chacham b'Torah, then he may do so and greet this person, such as saying Shalom Aleichem Mori Rabbi or something like that. For example, if he met his father or his Rav or Mishu Gadol Mimeno B'Chokhmah, someone who is clearly greater than himself in Torah and wisdom, Umeshiv Shalom L'Chol Adam Shenotanu Shalom. And if someone turned to you in that situation and showed you respect and greeted you, you are required to respond and not, and this is a very important lesson, not to insult the other, not to allow the other person, has for sure, to be insulted because you didn't respond. In other words, we don't speak and we don't socialize, and we don't do other things during Kriyat Shema, obviously. But we do not completely detach ourselves from reality and from social norms and Torah norms and realities. So this halacha is a very interesting halacha, a very important halacha, that kavod b'riyot is a very, very central concept. It's not true that if you're a very frum Jew, a very motivated and pious Jew, that you should not concern yourself. You do not need to concern yourself with kavod b'riyot and worrying about how you treat other people, or whether they might be insulted by something that you did or didn't, or omitted to do, such as respond to their greeting or something like that. Dozing. Hayakore b'msa perek. Now, what we just said before, everything we just said a moment ago, refers to a situation where the person was ben perek leferek. If a person was at the end had just finished one perek, one parasha, and now was about to move on to the next one. But if a person is in the middle of a parasha, in the middle of Vayam Shema, shall we say, והיה קורא באמצע הפרק, אינו פוסק ומתחיל לשאול, אלא בשלו מישהו מתיירא ממנו. Then it is more hamur, it is more, we are more stringent about when we allow a person to desist from reciting Kriyat Shema for a moment and deal with some other matter. So previously, if a person was between parakim and the other person involved was someone that you must show respect to, then you're allowed to do so. But in the middle of a perek, it's only if there's someone to whom, from someone that you have reason to fear. Mishahu mithyareh mimeno, kehon melech, such as some king or some such person, or anas, v'chayoseh b'hem. Anas is not a rapist. It refers to any violently inclined individual who may attack you or cause you great harm because he has the power to do so. Such a person is an anas. Obviously, such a person is a rasha. That goes without saying. And it might be a Jew, it might be a non-Jew. It doesn't make a difference. Just as in the case of a melech, hopefully a real normal Jewish melech would understand what's going on and would not be concerned that you didn't say anything to him if you're in the middle of Kriyat Shema. But there may be, as we know, unfortunately, there may be a Jewish king who's also not really someone who should be king. Not to mention there might be an altogether evil person. Maybe some Roman emperor. That was the classic example that was in the mind of the Chachamim when we're speaking about these things. But if we're talking about someone it's not someone that you're concerned that will harm you in any serious way, such as your father or kechon aviu or rabo, im natanu shalom tehila posek u'meshiv lo shalom. There you do not initiate this conversation, but if the other person did, then you can respond. Now, having spoken about parakim and parshiyot, Rambam now tells us what are we referring to. He says, "Ve'edohen ben parakim, ben beracha rishona lishniya." When this Mishnah, which discusses these ideas, speaks about ben parakim, and what we learn is in the Talmud is that the perek is not only the perek from the Torah, the actual parshiyot from the Torah, but also the brachot have the status of a perek. So, ben bracha rishna lishniya, ben shniya lishema, ben shema l'vayom shemua, ben vayom shema l'vayomer, all those places during Kriyat Shema are considered ben parakim. In other words, intermediate places where it is more permissible to stop and do something else if necessary. In some of the Defusim, there's some superfluous addition here, which we are not going to read. So all these places between the brachot and between the parashiyot, these are all referred to as ben aparakim. And the halachot that we just learned apply to those places. So if a person is at that point, finds himself at that point when reciting Kriyat Shema. Aval ben vayom lemet yasiv. Harehu ke'emsa parak. Even though lichora should have the same status as between in any of these other places that we mentioned, there should be also considered ben aparakim, and therefore it is easier to kal yoter. It is more permissible to stop at such or interrupt the reading at that point. Nevertheless, between the end of Vayomer, in other words, Ani Adonai Elohechem Emeth, and the beginning of Emeth V'Yasiv, which we always run together, Arehu Kemsa Perek. V'lo yafsik ela lish'ol mipnei ha'yirah u'lashiv mipnei ha'kavod. So at that point, you should not stop, you should not interrupt your reading, unless it is with regards to someone that one fears, mipnei ha'yirah, or lahashiv mipnei ha'kavod, to respond to someone to whom you must show respect. According to the Torah, you must show them respect. And therefore you should respond to them if they greeted you. Now, probably a serious person, if they were aware that you were reading Kriyat Shema, would not address you. But obviously they didn't realize. They saw you sitting, they didn't know what you were saying or doing at that moment, and they did. So again, we see that even though this person wouldn't have done so had they realized what was going on, you show them, you owe them that respect. And kavod bariot is a very important thing, not to mention kibud avoem or kavod rabo. In other words, or even someone who's not rabo, some great chacham. These things are sufficient and valid reasons to interrupt Kriyat Shema.
In Hilchot Mechila wa Hanukkah, when Rambam is discussing Kriyat HaHalel, he talks about being mafsik ben perek leperek, and not during the perek, and so on and so forth. Is he referring to the same exact situation here with Shelat Shalom?
First of all, let me open up what you're referring to. So Rambam says, Kol hayom kasher likriyat halel. The mitzvah of reading Hallel is not necessarily in the morning or any specific hour of the day, but can be recited at any point during the day, from early morning till evening. Similar to Kriyat Shema, if you recite the Pesukim of Hallel in the reverse order, lo yatsa dehova. Kara v'shaha v'hazar v'kara. That's what we saw before about Kara l'serurin, reading it in installments, as it were. Afal pisha shaha kadelivot kulo yatsa. Similar to what we saw with Kriyat Shema also. Not that this is normal or correct behavior, but if one did so, one did not interrupt other things, then when you say the Chovah, one performed the mitzvah of reading Hallel. Yomim shegomorim bahem et Hallel. On those days when it is a Chovah to read Hallel, yesh lo lafsik ben perek leferek. One may stop or interrupt in between parakim. In other words, the perek as they appears in the Tanakh as a new perek. Aval be'emtza perek lo yafsik. Lichora, Rambam is referring to the same situation that we're discussing here, although Rambam doesn't say here explicitly, yesh lo lafsik ben perek leferek. But of course you could ask, why would a person wish to do so? It's not as if, it doesn't make sense that Rambam is saying that you can just choose to go off and do something else because the Spirit moves you and come back to Hallel in 20 minutes' time. It doesn't make sense that that's what's being discussed here. It's true that Rambam is very, very, maybe overly concise here, and maybe we would expect, not that I certainly would not consider myself worthy of suggesting to Rambam what he should have written, but perhaps we would have expected the Rambam to explain use just another few words to tell us what hefsek you're referring to. Yesh lo lafsik ben perek leperek, aval be'emtza perek lo yafsik. The truth is that this is, I think, another example of what we see in a number of places in Mishneh Torah of the Rambam, where Rambam sometimes is essentially basing himself or assuming that he's basing himself on an assumption. He's relying on an assumption, which is that you've been studying Mishneh Torah ala Seder, in order from the beginning to the end. And you recall what it says earlier in Hilchot Kriyat Shema, and you will immediately discern that this halacha is very similar to what we discussed there. And you would immediately put two and two together, and you would understand what's being said. And it's a very fair assumption if you assume that people are studying the Sefer from the beginning and working their way through perek after perek, which is what Rambam intended. That was Rambam's intention. There's no question that was Rambam's intention. He says so. It's obvious, self-evident, but he also says so explicitly, both in his Hakdama and even perhaps more explicitly in his some of his letters that he writes to his Talmid Rabbi Yosef V'Aknin and others. So it seems that Rambam here's another example of this phenomenon, where Rambam is relying on the fact, assuming that you've read something very similar before, and what he wrote here is going to immediately be self-explanatory. When Rambam goes on to say this halacha, by the way, when we read not all of Hallel, but what some people refer to as half Hallel or Hallel b'diluch, some parts are left out, which is Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Chodesh, as that's minhag. Rambam says, Yesh lo lafsik ben afilu be'emtza perek posek. The reason for this is Nchora, because as Rambam wrote above in Halacha Zayin, he says there, Aval b'rashei hodashim kriyat halel minhag. Let me show you. Rambam says in Halacha Zayin, he mentions earlier when on which days you recite Kriyat Halel. Aval b'rashei hodashim kriyat halel minhag. The whole concept of reciting Halel on Rosh Chodesh was not a taken of the Chachamim. It was a minhag that grew up in Bavel, as we know, we see in the Talmud, Masechet Megillah explicitly. We'enam miswa. In other words, it's not a miswa midivrei sofrim, it's a minhag, a nice minhag, but it's a minhag. Minhag zeb tzibur, and this minhag only applies to a tzibur. In other words, in a Bet Knesset, they ought to recite Halel. Lefichach korim b'diluch ve'en mevarachim alav. According to Rambam, when Halel is read b'diluch on Rosh Chodesh, there's no bracha. Rambam is essentially a dat yahid on this matter, but that is Rambam's position. She'en mevarachim ala minhag. And that is why he's able to say in the halacha that we just read, in halacha teth, b'yamim shekorim b'hem b'diluch afilu be'emtza perek posek, because there was no bracha. And if there's no bracha, it's easier. Even in the middle of the perek, it's possible to be posek, because what you're doing essentially is reciting Tehillim. In other words, the bracha is what gives a special status to what you're doing and turns it into Kriyat Ha'alel as opposed to what is referred to in Yiddish as Tilim Zogen, reciting Tehillim, where one is allowed to stop in the middle for this or that reason. Perhaps it's not ideal, but it's mutar. So it's good that you pointed this out early on, and this is a further indication, even though we did not really require further indication, that learning Mishneh Torah of the Rambam is something that should be undertaken in a very systematic and orderly manner, so that one sees the different things and will recall the various things that were mentioned earlier, and will make the connections between certain things that otherwise a person may not do. So that is a word to the wise. Heyu beruchim, shalom shalom, hizku v'yames levavchem, kol hamiyahalim el Adonai. Shalom v'nisahon.